Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar presented by Blank Rome and the Winvale Group on business challenges in today's government market. If you are having any technical difficulties, the WebEx support number is 866-229-3239. Again, that number is 866-229-3239. The last 8 months have created unprecedented disruptions in the business of government contracting. Many of you have already experienced some of these impacts. Our speakers, Al Kreichman of Blank Rome and Brian Dunn of the Winvale Group, are here today to give you information, tools, and insights to best navigate this difficult terrain. Al Kreichman has over 30 years' experience advising government contractors in all aspects of the business. Al started his career with the General Counsel of the Navy and with the U.S. Treasury Department and has a very broad-based public contracting practice. Al, please say hello.
Hello, welcome.
Brian Dunn is the managing partner and founder of the Winvale Group and has over 15 years' experience in government contracts, consulting, and marketing. Brian, please say hello.
Hello, welcome.
During the presentation, we encourage you to use the Q&A tool at the top of the menu bar to submit questions to our speakers. We will take time at the end of the presentation to answer all your questions. Upon the conclusion of the webinar, we will email our participants with a copy of the presentation along with a short survey evaluation form, which we will review to gain valuable insights for future programs. With that, I will turn it over to Brian for the first segment on sequestration.
Thank you, Stephanie. Today we're going to be a bit ambitious, and we're going to tackle 8 subject areas that Al and I think have emerging trends and changes that are relevant in today's government contracting world. The first item we're going to be talking about is sequestration and some practical business advice to everyone. We'll be talking about maximizing recovery on contract terminations, recent changes to the small business program rule, bid and size protests as a business continuity tool. We'll also be diving into the U.S. Trade Agreements Act and how it remains a problem area for some, business ethics and corporate training. We'll also be talking about suspensions and how they're raising, and whistleblower issues, finally, and the privilege of self-audit. There is significant business opportunities in the government right now, and Al will talk firsthand about a basic building block.
Thank you, Brian, and welcome to everyone. I thought we'd start here on the concept of, quote, a really good proposal, because that really is the building block for the first couple of business strategies that we're going to touch. In the last 8 months, I've seen a significant increase in the government's rigidity in terms of compliance with proposal requirements. I would say to you that a first critical action to take is to increase the proposal quality of your shop. Whatever it is, it needs to increase. If the standard before was hitting a quarter from 500 yards, you now hit a dime. I've just seen an amazing number of what I'll call fly-specking exercises by the government in rejecting otherwise compliant proposals. A second point that I need to bring, because I see more and more of this, is be careful about including conditions or assumptions in your proposals. You're never going to feel any of these impacts of sequestration if you don't get through the first hurdle, which is a successful proposal. And I've seen large numbers of contractors be disqualified for including conditions or assumptions in their proposals. We had a client whose competitor was awarded a $10 million contract. The matter was protested. We obtained a copy of the opposing winning proposal, found a condition in it. They disqualified that proposal, and today our client has that $10 million contract and not the competitor. The last major point that I would like to raise here in the outset is relationships. Relationships in government contracting are critical. A friend from Homeland Security says that the government doesn't contract with people it doesn't know or it doesn't like, and that is true. And relationships with government acquisition personnel are made even more important today by virtue of the use of the best value continuum. Because you know what? best value is in the eye of the beholder, and best value is something that procurement officials can judge, believe it or not, based on relationships. So please keep that in mind, and please understand that these basic building blocks are essential to your success in the government markets we now face. Brian, let me turn it over to you to talk about sort of the overwhelming impacts and strategies dealing with the reality of sequestration.
Thank you, Al. Well, where do we begin? For those living under a rock, Congress's game of chicken resulted in sequestration, which officially started March 1st. $85.3 billion have started to be cut from the federal budget, and it will be cut equally between defense and non-defense discretionary funding through September 30th of this year. And if Congress can't reach a deal, then all these cuts are part of a 10-year, what they call budget control law that caps federal spending through 2022, and that is another 8 years. So what you'll see on the slide in the budget numbers are the defense discretionary budget will take a larger hit than the civilian side because it has less money protected by mandatory programs. Basically, on the defense side, the only thing not affected was spending on military personnel. So while we're being used as pawns in this political game of chess, the news isn't all that bad. Contractors need to be smarter and react quickly, but there's still plenty of business opportunities out there. One example is technology, where we see technology expected growth of 6% next year, and due in large part to cost-saving initiatives and executive orders coming from Obama. So we're seeing the government remain as interested as ever in cloud-based services and being mobile and being secure in cyberspace. In fact, it's not so much cybersecurity anymore than cyber warfare. Here are some numbers to consider when speaking with your government customers. We're not going to go into this now. They will be available for anyone who wants a copy of the PowerPoint when we're done. But we did break this down by agency. Here's another slide. Some of it you may find interesting that the Veterans Affairs were spared from sequestration cuts. Maybe this was bipartisan politics, but certainly an anomaly. So let's talk business strategy. Contractors should understand that acquisition personnel are going to be required to ensure all contracting activities are essential to their agency's mission, or they may say mission-critical systems. So contract actions such as add-ons, option year awards, or recompetes, you're going to see that less common because agencies are basically going to have a harder time justifying them. We've already seen the government use their termination ability, which includes cancellation for convenience, which Al will talk about more later. And new contract awards will probably have shorter periods of performance awarded.
Yeah, Brian, on this point, let me note that you need to keep an eye on the contractual actions that the government is taking because it may trigger your entitlements to compensation. Obviously, easy ones might be a stop work order, but other things can happen like requested delays or things that change the means or manner of performance, which are called constructive changes. All of those can increase your cost, and while the government believes it may be saving cost, in fact, it could be giving rise to your right to additional compensation. So it's important to monitor that, to recognize when that happens, and to know your rights and your deadlines for asserting rights to increase compensation due to the government action.
That's a good point. What we're recommending to our clients now is to really be proactive and stay in close contact and communication with your government customers, those that you have open task orders and relationships with. Their budget challenges really should be your budget challenges. The last thing I'll say on this slide is you want to be wary and cognizant of any expensive or unnecessary project costs, especially labor. You have technical employees, you may have subject matter experts, you may have people with security clearances. So, we advise expect a call from the government, expect a conversation around price reductions. Take a look at your current project budgets and prepare for one. If project requirements change, then you'll be quick to change for employee and project costs. For new proposals, we also want to stress the importance of being the lowest priced, technically acceptable. We all know low price has always been very important, but with sequestration, it's even more important. We'll also see past performance are going to continue to be important, but don't focus so much on selling best value that you may have in the past. It used to be that the large government integrators such as Lockheed Martin, Harris Corporation, Northrop Grumman, those guys wouldn't come down and bid on contracts less than $20 million. But what we're seeing now in the market is that they're coming down to bid on those lower contracts just to keep their revenue flat. So in the strategy there is that once they win that contract, they're trying to immediately add to the task order and push for bilateral mods. So the strategy here is to look for additional contract opportunities with your core government customer base, rather than spend time, and energy getting into new agencies or new departments, because it will be more difficult. With this last slide on hedging strategies, we wanted to remind everyone that the government is moving away from those costs that include things like conferences and trade shows. We all know that thanks to GSA's Public Building Service and the Las Vegas embarrassment last year, the government has taken a step back. And it's not just GSA, it's everyone. And they're staying more close to home when it comes to events. But some don't realize there's this quiet push for secure online conferencing. So as the government starts to make these changes, be open to connecting with government buyers differently and ask them about these type of initiatives. Lastly, we all know the federal government is different. They want to be treated differently. We all know the tons of acronyms that they use, but so many contractors forget to federalize their brand. The government always uses Google just like everybody else in the web. So make sure you have a government focus on your website. We think now is a really good time to reflect on your go-to-market strategy, SEO, search engine optimization for your website. Start to get more familiar with some social media and really look to federalize your brand. Now I'll turn it over to Al, who will discuss terminations.
Thanks, Brian. Obviously, of the points that Brian made, I think it's critical to keep in contact with your government customer. It's essential to build your relationship with them if you don't have a strong one, because again, at the end of the day, that's going to be the difference between how you're treated in a certain circumstance. And one of the more difficult circumstances that you might encounter is the termination. Of course, that's what the convenience termination is, what no one wants, unless you're in a severe loss situation, in which case sometimes you can actually do better. But what we're seeing in the last several months is that the government is looking harder at terminations and also has been exercising its rights in a sharper way to deal with the budget pressures. We have seen in the last several months, in the last year and a half, an increase at back charges, government claims against the contractor for noncompliance, which we've seen an increase in penalties for underperformance work statements, where the government is asserting that money has to come back because your standards had not been met. And then we're seeing increase in default terminations, because if the government default terminates the contractor, then they don't have to pay the costs that are reimbursable as a convenience termination. So all of those trends suggest a couple of business strategies. First of all, do a contract checkup. Are you compliant? Do you have any major or minor issues that need to be addressed, that the contracting officer hasn't brought up, or the program people may not have brought up, but if you know they're there, you should address them. Don't wait to hear from them. Do your own checkup. The second situation, and we've had this happen with clients in some very important contracts, is that if you're confronted with a contract termination, it's not necessarily final. There is a way and a couple of strategies to undo it. You can actually work the agency. We've taken clients in and made high-level pitches and have gotten senior officials to overturn the termination. We've gone to Congress and have had meetings where the agency officials are brought in to a meeting with a representative. They have a heart-to-heart, and the next thing you know, the termination is rescinded. So it's not necessarily a done deal. And then there's also an increasing trend to challenge those terminations. There was a case a couple of weeks ago called Tiger Swan, where a contractor successfully contested a termination, and that can be an effective course, but the first two are preferable. Now let's talk about what happens if you are faced with a termination and you need to look at what your entitlements are. There's a widespread misunderstanding here about the different entitlements that arise under the different termination clauses. One is Part 12, the commercial items, and the second one is Part 49, the long-form termination. We're all people in the industry are very familiar with Part 49. It's very well developed. There's extensive regulations that have been interpreted for years that, essentially, in a fixed price contract, it turns it into a cost reimbursable contract. There's well settled principles there. But in Part 12, which are the commercial items termination provision, which you see more and more, there are some uncertainties, and it's because, unlike Part 49, Part 12 mixes concepts of price and cost. The formula is there. You're to receive a percentage of the contract price reflecting the percentage of the work performed prior to notice plus reasonable charges. So there's really a component of both cost and price in that, and that has created a lot of confusion, because how do you measure what the amount of price recovery you should receive when you have partially performed and not received significant payment? Well, there are a couple of different ways to calculate it, and believe it or not, the numbers can be all over the map depending upon what kind of contract you have. You could have a manufacturing contract with a long lead item. You could have a service contract. You could have a small form construction contract. Your outcomes could differ widely. And I will tell you that the government itself is not familiar in detail with the alternatives and the differences. The generally accepted accounting principles can come in here. There's a way to look at percentage of physical completion. There's a way to look at percentage effort completed, and on a unit price. So by being smart about this, if it happens to you, you can really increase your termination costs significantly. First of all, know the different measures, and obviously you're going to argue for the most effective recovery, and then be creative. We had an opportunity where a contract was terminated after a bid protest, and we were able to get our client all of its legal fees associated with the bid protest. And the old rule, right? If you don't ask, you don't get, and every now and then you can be successful. So that covers what I really wanted to say about termination. Obviously, many firms may have questions about this, and we'd be happy to answer any as a follow-up. But I now want to move into the next part of our program, which deals with some very significant changes made in small business contracting. And these changes are important because they affect both large and small businesses. They dictate different business strategies and different actions that large and small businesses should take going forward in the government market. And these the most significant ones that I'm just going to talk about now have come from revisions made by the recently signed Defense Authorization Act in 2013. A really significant change has occurred in the mentor-protege program. The mentor-protege program exists under many separate agencies, but the sort of gold standard of them is the SBA mentor-protege program, which until this statute, was only limited to 8A corporations. So you could have an 8A partner on an SBA-approved mentor-protege relationship, and you would be able to get many benefits, including structuring joint ventures with them and avoidance of the affiliation rules. The statute has now opened these to all small businesses. So effective, it should be, rulemaking is due in September. So effective September, there should be an entirely new landscape that will allow you to pursue small mentor-protege relationships with all small businesses, meaning that they just have to qualify for their under the size standard. There already is other legislation dealing with those changes for service-disabled, better-known companies and hub zones and others, but this is a real big deal. A second big deal, and this one is more problematic because it appears to have taken effect immediately, is a change in the old limitation on subcontracting rule. Essentially this means that when there's a small business set-aside, restricted contract, that you would have a small business prime contractor, and that prime contractor under the old rules had to do 50% of the cost of the labor, and you could exclude materials and ODCs from that. So you could structure a situation with the small business prime subcontracting significant portions of work to a large business and still be in compliance as long as you met that generous test. They now have changed that to require the 50% to be measured against the amount that the prime contractor is paid by the government. And that is very significant because it will require very increased amounts of performance by the small business subcontractor compared to the prior universe and prior world. And the other thing that they have done to this is they've added a $500,000 penalty, or it could even be higher if the subcontract payments are higher if you don't comply. Before, there really was no compliance with the limitation on subcontracting clause. There was no real teeth to it, except in a rare case where you might catch them in a protest. There was nothing to back it. Now, there's really significant penalties. And the other thing about this is that unlike the other parts of the regulation, this one appears to be effective today. It doesn't have any reference to a rulemaking, so that should be significant for you. Also, the changes have imposed significant new requirements for complying with your subcontracting plan. And Brian has had an opportunity to address those.
And I'll say that we're seeing the SBA really step up in these compliance audits. It seems like the SBA has been empowered by the Obama administration to tackle some of these small business issues, and we're really having to help support clients with drafting the plan, outreach efforts, and all those obligations that they have to maintain.
Okay. So you now need to pay. If your subcontracting plan has been in a drawer, take it out, look at it, and see where you are. Finally, there's been increased penalties for false certifications. So what are the business strategies that are suggested by this? Large and small businesses together, now that the mentor-protege doors are open, go partner shopping. Look for strategic players who are small and align with them, because you're now going to be able to form joint ventures and escape affiliation issues. Take a look for purposes of contractors on set-aside contractors. If you're large or small, you better take a look at your subcontracting percentages, certainly on new bids. Existing contracts are one thing, but on new bids, you need to take a look at others and make sure that you are going to meet that new rule. Third, a little-known regulation that grew out of the Small Business Jobs Act in 2010 is called the presumed loss rule, and this essentially says that if there is a miscertification of size or status of a small business, you have to give the government all the money back that you received on the contract, plus perhaps more. This has significantly increased the importance of being correct in self-certifying your status, or making sure that if you're dealing with, as a large business, you're dealing with a small business prime or a counterparty, you need to be sure that they are correct and that you're properly relying on their status, because if they're wrong and you're wrong, you're going to end up paying back all the contract proceeds. A last strategy that I'll mention, it's really more of a general point, but you'll be surprised how effective coming to Washington and meeting with agency acquisition policy officials can be. These people are happy to be visited by contractors, happy to hear about issues, and we've taken contractors in for meetings over a period of day with several officials, and almost all of them come back with recommendations, action lists. The agency official will pick up the phone and say, make sure you introduce this contracting company to the following 4 people. It's a wonderful opportunity. Not that many people call on these acquisition policy people, but it's a great tool to use. So that wraps up what I wanted to say about small business. These are very significant changes, and you really should look hard at what we have recommended and follow it up, because it will be the difference between significant business and not. I now want to move to the next topic of our presentation, dealing with bid or size protest as a business continuity tool. We've been focused here on recent trends, and if you look at these statistics, you may or may not be surprised, but you can see that we've had a 75% jump in these bid protests since 2007. And why is this? Well, the most recent statistics are that I'll call them well-drafted protests have achieved some degree of relief for the contractor 42% of the time. Most of that happens in the form of corrective action, which would be, for example, the government realizes that it made a mistake in evaluating your proposal, and now you're back in the competitive range. Or they made a mistake in not awarding to you, and you should have received the award. So the numbers of relief that have come out of protest is really very significant, and it's even led some companies to realize that, this is a fact of life. I need to, I might as well put protest in my BD budget, because I'm probably going to get one, and if I win, I might have to fend one off, and if I lose, I might want to take a look at trying to get it changed. But certainly for incumbents who think they should have received award, felt they had reasonably good relationships with their agency, when they lose, I'm seeing just a very high percentage of those companies taking a run at a protest. Why do they do that? Well, one, they feel that they were entitled to win in the first place, but second of all, depending upon the options available to the agency, often will be able to benefit because the government may not have any choice but to extend the contract or while the bid process is pending. So it gives the contractor an opportunity to receive more money. A protest has a 100-day turnaround, a GAO, and that's over 3 months of revenue if it goes all the way. And sometimes you can use that time to rebuild relationships, correct your problems, and get another shot at the apple. Also, companies are doing this because as money moves to these IDIQ vehicles, you really have to win those. I mean, if you're going to bid, if you're going to bid an IDIQ, that's an important asset to win. And if you lose it, then you're not going to have access to millions of dollars of potential task orders. So there's a very high cost benefit in cases of these IDIQ contracts with respect to taking a run at them. So what are the business strategies here that you need to be aware of in dealing with this tool? First of all, the deadlines are very short. And when the clock starts to run can also be confusing. So you need to know the deadlines, and you have to act within what I call leverage windows. Leverage windows are within the original 10-day period between the adverse action and when you have to protest. And we've had cases where we've gone in day 3 and sat down or presented a document to the government, and they've agreed to correct the problem before the 10 days was up. And the reason they did that is because they knew we had the ability to take a run at it, and we also convinced them that we were correct. So act within these leverage windows. Second, there are unfortunately recurrent problems that lead to misevaluations and wrongful exclusions or wrongful awards. The largest class of them is in the non-adherence to the RFP criteria. There were mistakes in how you were evaluated. There may have been unequal or misleading discussions, so that's a declining area, but nonetheless, if you had discussions with the government and then you get your exclusion letter and they never brought up the main reason you were excluded, well, you might have had inadequate discussions. And probably one of the hotter areas is the price or past performance evaluation. When the government does an evaluated price, it's easy to make a mistake. And, of course, past performance is a very subjective issue, and contractors will fight that hard when they receive marginal ratings or are surprised to learn that they've been given an improper performance evaluation grade. I haven't mentioned size protest much, but a size protest is different from a bid protest. You generally have 5 days in which to file it from when you receive the initial notice of award or notice of intended award. If you knock out your competition and determine they're other than small, they are going to be off the radar for at least a year. And there's also, I mentioned before, this presumed loss rule is what I call a silver bullet, because under the size protest procedures, the contracting officer can look at this at any time. And if you have evidence that the company that just won the contract that you bid for is either not small or wasn't truly a preference contractor, you can take a run at this with the contracting officer, and there's a FAR provision that requires the contracting officer to take it seriously. So even if you miss the deadlines, you may still be able to act on this and put yourself in a position. There's been lots of dialogue on bid protests and how they're viewed. Dan Gordon, who was the former administrator of OFPP, wrote an article recently published through GW where he expressed his opinion on the cost-benefit analysis of this. So we've just been talking about getting into the contracts. We've talked about the building blocks. We've talked about sequestration, and the bid protest process here is also focused here on winning contracts and our termination provisions and discussion related to getting out of them. I now want to focus on the middle part, and I'm going to turn this over to Brian to have him say a few words about compliance with the government contract.
Thank you, Al. This is one of my favorite Dilbert cartoons. Kind of says it all. One of the bumps in the damp mattress for poor Dilbert here could certainly be the Trade Agreements Act. This is a good intro into the next section. So the Trade Agreements Act has been around for more than 1979, and there's a lot of contractors who still don't quite understand the basics, especially those who sell products under the GSA Schedule program. So basically it states that a product sold must be from the U.S. or a designated country, or if it was partially made in a non-designated country, that product be substantially transformed in the U.S. or in a designated country into a new and different article of commerce. So it's a lot of language there, and the problem that the Trade Agreement Act creates for contractors, especially resellers who have GSA contracts, are there's so many products that are now being made in China. And, that's the elephant in the room. It just seems like more and more people are outsourcing this and moving it ashore to China. And so selling one product made in China can have significant consequences if you sell it to the federal government. Because GSA sees how important TAA or Trade Agreement Act compliance is, those with GSA contracts know that GSA, they require a country of origin or a COO listing beside each and every product. And this can be especially difficult for contractors who sell thousands and thousands of products, like those who sell through a catalog or an e-commerce type listing with multitude of manufacturer relationships. So basically, that poor reseller, they have to verify that country of origin for each and every product. So in terms of business strategy, GSA contractors particularly need to spend extra due diligence and make sure that you're making the correct country of origin determination. And you're not relying solely on what the manufacturer says. When Al and I conduct a lot of these self-audits for some of our clients, and we get into the Trade Agreements Act, we actually physically look at inventory. We open up the product. We look at the country markings on the product, not just the box, but the physical item. So if a reseller, they drop ship, if they don't keep inventory, we recommend that you travel out to your manufacturer's location if possible, a distribution warehouse, and spend the needed time to look for yourself. If your government customer gets a product that they've ordered and it says made in China, trust me, you're going to hear about it. So we recommend also that GSA resellers get identification language in supplier agreements, which can also include that letter of supply that sometimes people use. So if a manufacturer or a supplier tells you that product is made in Mexico, and it turns out that it's made in China, the Justice Department will look at the reseller. They'll find them liable first, not necessarily that manufacturer. So, what you want to do is have the right identification language in your supplier agreements so you have recourse if needed. Another thing to remember, that the manufacturing processes and costs, they can change at any minute. Obviously there's a lot of incentives to move to China for manufacturers. So the product you thought could have made in the Midwest, could have been made in Omaha, could be made in China next year. And so what you want to do is keep in good close communication with those manufacturers and suppliers. So when they do that, you're tapped into that, and you kind of understand what you need to do and make adjustments against. Lastly, some people get the Trade Agreements Act mixed up with the Buy American Act. We all know BAA is primarily the Department of Defense, but they're really completely different. The Buy American Act determination deals with a percentage of the cost of the components. And people think that that's the approach they should take with the Trade Agreements Act, when the Trade Agreements Act deals with this substantial transformation interpretation, which is a very, very difficult thing for contractors to interpret. So if you're unsure about the country of origin, we advise simply remove it, don't sell it, and if you feel there's a good business need, seek outside advice, seek professional guidance until you're 100% sure.
And just to underscore this, 2 weeks ago, the federal government just intervened in a fairly high-profile case involving the Trade Agreements Act. It was a False Claims Act case brought by a competitor to the Capital Supply Company, the intervention of the United States is a very significant action in a False Claims Act case, but it goes to show that the government is looking at this, and this particular case concerned the sale of Fellows Company shredders, which were made in China, to the federal government. And this contractor, who is now the subject of this federal case, is looking at very, very severe penalties and financial exposure due to noncompliance with the Trade Agreements Act. So this is a real and current issue.
I think it's important to add that Capital Supply is also a GSA scheduled contractor. This happens a lot more than you think. It's not specific to one industry or one schedule. It's really prevalent on almost all of them. So it's something to be cautious about. Next, we'll talk about business ethics. This is finally something in Congress that both political parties can agree with each other on. Kind of a win-win, at least in the political arena. Business ethics and conduct, it first came out almost 3 years ago, and a lot like other FAR regulations, it was a little slow to adapt, but we've recently seen this start to change the culture of government contracting from the top down. We're seeing a lot more desk audits from the Department of Labor has an office called Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, and they do these desk audits, and when they come in, they're asking to see a contractor's government ethics code, and they're looking for written process, procedure, training documentation. I'm also willing to guess that if any of you have been a subcontractor under a government contract or have worked with the prime, that you've had this requirement and you may not know about it. So if you look at the required, there's 9 flow-down clauses for subcontractors that are at minimum required. Business ethics and conduct is listed first, and we're seeing all large government integrators are including this as part of their standard T's and C's language. So you might have this a few different times, you just maybe haven't flagged it or given it enough attention. Another thing that contractors don't realize is there's a big difference between commercial ethics codes or policies and the one for government contractors. They think, oh, I've got a commercial ethics code, it should be fine, when it's not. And the government requirements are completely different. And in my opinion, they're more strict. They're certainly more explicit. So they include sections on hiring of federal employees, kickbacks, it's a pretty dirty word around D.C., the use of lobbyists, conflicts of interest, often referred to as OCI, and dealing with government classified information, just to include some of that as an example. So the business strategy here really is to be aware and establish an ethics code for your government contracting division. There are additional requirements for some contractors, those who are not a small business. There are additional requirements, and those who have a contract value valued at more than $5 million, there are additional internal control system requirements there. I'm guessing a lot of people on the phone today are at that point or above that threshold. So when I help a lot of my clients write these government ethic codes, I always advise them to establish these ethics codes and policies and practices that the company can grow into. Don't look at just the minimum. We all want to be a bigger contractor and land a larger contract, so try to pull in more of those clauses that you might have to add in the near future. Add them today, and that way you won't have to work with revision after revision. Lastly, once you finalize your government ethics code, you've got to follow through with employee training. You can't just distribute, but there's got to be an element of training, specifically to those people who are involved in the performance of a federal contract. And you also want to establish levels of discipline for those violations. This is the kind of thing that government auditors will ask to see if you ever get a desk audit. They're going to look for this kind of detail. So now I'll turn it over to Al, and I think he's going to discuss suspensions.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Just a note on the importance of this. Each agency has an official called a suspending and debarring official, and several agencies, SDOs, have taken the position that if a government contractor does not have a government contract compliance program, that company is unfit to receive a contract award. In other words, it is using the term non-responsible. Responsibility is a basic requirement to be a government contractor. It's a term of art. It's in the FAR. It includes having the requisite fitness and integrity and systems to be a government contractor. And if you don't have a compliance program, the government is taking the position that you can't even receive a government contract because it means that you don't have fitness, integrity, and the requisite systems. So, what are some of the consequences that can occur if you don't have a system, you haven't done training, and you get into a situation where you receive a notice from the government that you're suspended from contracting? The reality here is that in the past, suspension and debarment had been a rarity. These offices have existed in the government for many years, but they had not been aggressively moving to impose suspension or debarments. As you can see from these charts between 2009 and 2011, this is up sharply, and this has very significant consequences for you as a government contractor or potential government contractor. You need to know that this is being looked at very closely, and you need to have these compliance systems in place. I mentioned before the Defense Authorization Act. That has increased the potential sanctions that can be applied, and additionally has required automatic suspension or debarments for certain types of activity. This activity is activity that can range from environmental violations to allowing a defective product to go through your chain. Could include selling Chinese products on your GSA schedule. Any one of these things could trigger a suspension. So what are some business strategies to avoid this problem? First of all, if you're of any size, appoint a chief compliance officer. And for those companies that have active boards, we recommend that you actually empower a board committee to deal with compliance. Second, we would recommend that you do a 6-month compliance review, a top-down check to see where you are, with respect to your obligations under your contract, and specifically certain schedule holders. Brian talked a lot about GSA schedules. You need to focus there on what are the hot topics, like Trade Agreements Act, like small business compliance, like something called the non-manufacturer rule, which is a rule that limits the ability for a small business to sell the products of a large business on a set-aside contract, and related issues. So there's no excuse really for a government contractor to be suspended unless there is a total breakdown in your organizational structure, and if you don't have a compliance plan and you haven't conducted training. There's been, on the slides here, a couple recent high-profile suspensions or notices of debarment. You do not want to get one of these. The suspensions can come out of the blue if you haven't caught the problem, and all of a sudden you're off the playing field. You can't get any new contracts. You can't get any new options. You go on a list of consolidated and suspended and debarred contractors. It is very negative. In addition to the fact that you have to report it from then for the next several years when you fill out your new contract applications or proposals. And how do some of these suspensions happen? And where do they start? And what could I do to head them off? Well, that's our final segment, dealing with whistleblower claims. Because here's another situation where there has been a sharp increase in these whistleblower claims. These are claims where individuals inside the company or even some outside who are competitors spot an item of non-compliance and bring what's called a key tam action or a claim under the False Claims Act against the company. You've all seen this. This has been in the press extensively. It's an exploding area. The statistics are here. 62% increase in settlements and judgments from 2011. You're talking about billions of dollars of recovery. And why do these happen? It's because the relators can have a huge payday, 15 to 25%. Former Vice President of Oracle got $100 million as his share of a False Claims Act case against Oracle related to its GSA schedule. So the GSA schedule is a hot area for this. There's all sorts of new cases being brought all the time, and you need to, again, be sure that you're in compliance with these rules. We've talked about GSA schedule pricing. We've talked about certifications. There's been a rash of cases where there's been violations of the Service Contract Act that have formed the basis for these. Also, I referred to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the UK Bribery Act. Very significant levels of action being taken under both those. The UK Bribery Act is a very expansive piece of legislation that can reach non-UK companies very easily and has significant consequences. So what we're recommending is a privileged self-audit. And a privileged self-audit means that it's protected by the attorney-client privilege, either an inside lawyer running it or outside counsel. And the reason that you want it privileged is because you want to control the information, you want it protected, you don't want self-critical findings, if they're generated from your audit, to be freely distributed. Or if the government does get a hold of them, you want to be able to assert that it's privileged and they can't use it. So it's essential, if you're going to do this, to have it privileged. And the final point here with respect to compliance and this privileged audit is that if you do it and you determine that you have compliance problems, there's a procedure called the mandatory disclosure rule which allows you to go to the agencies, provide the information, and that can help you with the issue of present responsibility. It can help avoid a suspension or debarment problem. It may or may not help with the False Claims Act issue, but at least it keeps you in the game. And again, why is this significant? Just want to go back to the chart. For all of those increased number of claims are all problems that could have been caught by a self-audit, and you could have been avoided. And so what are the recommendations here? We think it would be very prudent to conduct a privileged self-audit, look at the situation, mitigate your risks, take remedial action, and last, why should you spend any money on this? Well, had that gentleman from Capital Supply spent a few $1,000s with a compliance audit, he probably would have been able to spend $10,000 and avoided $850,000 of exposure. So there's a very high return on investment from doing one of these and bringing your ship back to the right channel. So at this point, I know we've covered a lot of material. I know it's been at a fast pace. We wanted to be sure that this was very informative. This is a summary of what we have covered today, and I hope it has been valuable and helpful. We now have an opportunity to receive some questions. Stephanie?
So one of the first questions we received, can you offer any advice or strategy for a GSA audit by the OIG?
The answer is yes. Number one, you must cooperate. Number two, you must immediately try to do your own internal review to ascertain what exposure you may have, and do your best to prepare a position to go in to try to negotiate a resolution. Brian?
Al, I'll add to that many people think these routine every 2-year visits from the Industrial Operations Analyst, or IOA, is an audit. Those are not audits, but when you hear from the OIG, those are serious auditors. They're coming with luggage. They're going to stay a few weeks, and you're going to get to know them very well. So certainly look out for them and bring in some outside guidance to help you through that.
Great, thank you. Next question, would you recommend having a totally separate website that is directed to the government, or can a website that offers pages for government be separate from corporate messaging?
I'll take that one. That's a good question. Many people establish a government market that's not just to the federal, but the state and local. And like I said before, the government wants to be treated differently. Many people, when they sell to the government, they say something like, do you use PTO? And they'll get offended with that, and they'll say, no, we have leave. So if it's part of your website or a separate website, a separate LLC or business entity, it's a good question to have, a business question to tackle, and you can really go either way. The important thing is that you've got content on there that speaks to that audience, and you're using the logos, the acronyms, and you're talking the right language.
Another question we received, what is fitness under a compliance program?
I'll take that. I mean, fitness is a general standard that's actually comes out of the Part 9 of the Federal Acquisition Regulations. It's an element of responsibility, and the government will look at your number of factors. Do you have systems, accounting systems? Do you have corporate integrity? Do you have a business accounting system, record keeping, training, assignment of executives? All the basic building blocks that you need to be a compliant government contractor all go into fitness. The government wants to be sure that its counterparty is a stand-up, experienced, highly qualified entity, and just like any other successful business, it has to have a corporate governance structure. It has to have a contract administration function. It has to have an accounting function. It has to have a legal function. And those are the building blocks that you have to have in place in order to be a contractor that is judged to be fit, and that's one of the objects that you try to attain under a compliance program if you don't have it.
Thank you, Al. What is the most important takeaway for a contractor operating in a sequestration environment?
Right. Well, with sequestration, as I alluded to, I would be prepared for the uncomfortable phone calls. The change of contracts, the price reduction requests. You may not see a true renegotiation, but they are going to be having dialogues as to what's mission critical and what they can cut. So be prepared for that. What you want to do is go through some of your cost elements, make sure that you're prepared to address that, because if you give them kind of a deaf ear, you may not see yourself around for too much longer. So be flexible.
We understand it's 1 o'clock, which is what we had stated to be the end of the webinar, but we do have a few more questions, so if you'd like to stay on the line, we encourage you to do so. The next question is, if the government cancels or terminates, how do you know if Part 12 or Part 49 apply?
The particular section under which the acquisition is conducted is supposed to be specified on the cover page of the awarded contract. There's a box that is checked that says FAR Part 12 or not. There's also a box lower in the form that indicates whether those clauses are included. But I will say that it can be confusing because often the government will also attach a Section I to the contract that will have a list of clauses incorporated by reference, and sometimes they will also include the Part 49 termination provision. So you have to look at it, and then you may need to get clarification, but it should be apparent from the face of the contract.
Thank you, Al. We have one last question, which is really a two-part question. What is involved in a privileged self-audit, and is it tax deductible?
Well, the second one is very easy. A privileged audit would be a business expense, a legal expense that should just flow like any other legal expense. The only time you might have a non-deductible or non-recoverable expense is if it's in relation to a fine or penalty. And then as far as what's involved in it, we generally do have a preliminary scoping conversation with the client, get an overview of their business, what they think their strengths and weaknesses are. We'll go in and take a look at those, give a preliminary report with recommendations for after doing a very short, low-cost Phase 1 look, and then depending on the results of Phase 1, the client and the recommendations in the Phase 1 report, the client gets to decide on what it wants to do with respect to the recommendations, and that will be handled on a Phase 2 basis, which is scalable for the size of the company.
And Al, I'll add that when we go in to do these audits, we can be pretty quick about it. Where we're running in multiple processes parallel to each other. Where the first we can be identifying, correcting problem areas. We don't have to wait to disclose it to correct it, and there's more of an immediate triage type of situation, or we can work with management to address some policy process changes, and that might be Phase 2, and that might also include disclosure to the government, or what we found and what we didn't find.
Thank you, Al and Brian. For the few questions that we could not get to today, we will be sure to follow up with you separately. Thank you for joining our webinar today. We hope you found the presentation to be useful. If you have any further questions or wish to receive further counsel on the topics discussed today, please don't hesitate to contact either Al or Brian. As a reminder, please remember to submit the survey form we will send to you following this presentation. Again, thank you for joining us today, and have a good afternoon.